Okay, this is the Right Fits podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Fitzpatrick here. This is my first podcast. I'm going to start doing them on pretty much my stream of mind, whatever comes to my mind, which is usually current event topics. We're going to talk about current event topics every time. It could be from UFOs to like the opioid crisis, like I'm going to talk about today. And obviously, the opioid crisis is one of the biggest things that's affecting the U.S. right now and Canada, really the Western world. The opioid crisis goes back a long time historically. It goes back all the way to, it goes back to the English and the Chinese. The English and the Chinese fought, I believe, multiple wars over opium. And this was hundreds of years ago. British ended up winning control of the opium production routes, and so opium use goes back quite a long time in the Western world, up till today, where many people bring up, for instance, like the Sackler family with Purdue Pharma and OxyContin, if you're familiar with that story. The Sackler family, essentially what they did was put misleading information on the bottles of OxyContin, and with the DEA's permission, or not the DEA, the FDA, I believe, they bribed the head of the FDA at the time in some hotel somewhere to get this new information put on the bottle that OxyContin was thought to be less addicting than other opiates, where this is obviously not true. Any doctor at the time worth their weight actually knew this, and some were 100% misled, and not all the doctors were getting people hooked knowingly, but this happened all the time. And just to be clear, OxyContin is, I hear people talk about this part of the opioid crisis all the time, and they get a lot of the information wrong. So oxycodone is the main drug in OxyContin, and it has been, it's been around a long, long time. Now, all OxyContin is taking. So the main drug that oxycodone comes in is called Percocet, and most people have probably heard that drug, Percocet. The main ingredient is acetaminophen and oxycodone. That's the opiate. And what Purdue Pharma did was take the acetaminophen, the Tylenol, out and put the milligrams of Percocet range from 5 to 10 milligrams generally in their pills, and oxycodone or OxyContin came out with extended release pills that range from 5 milligrams all the way up to 160 milligrams at one point. So the double strength Percocet, the 10 milligram Percocet, that would be 16 of those in one dose. And you see the implications of what that would do to somebody if they're on that long term. Obviously, you'll be addicted to that very quickly. Within a week or two, some people will already be physically dependent on those drugs. So obviously, Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family, the family that ran Purdue Pharma, and allegedly got all these people hooked to these drugs, knowing they were addictive. This was the initial start of the opiate epidemic. A lot of people at least point to this part. Now, I believe it goes back farther than that, actually, to when opium first became illegal, because we had opium. We had morphine and heroin. Funny thing, heroin actually was invented as a cure to get off of morphine, which is just hilarious and like the most classic American, drug system as you can get. And Big Pharma plays a huge part in the opioid crisis, obviously, like we just talked about. But there's many other factors that go into this, including the legalization So as I go through these podcasts, you're going to see kind of some of my political views spill over into what I'm talking about with the current events. However, I'm not going to come out and clearly state what my politics are. You will kind of learn to understand them in your own way through listening to these podcasts. But the the criminalization movement, I should say, of opiates, it goes back to demonizing the Chinese with the opium dens, in the 20s in America, and just like stereotyping Hispanics and blacks with using marijuana to make that illegal. They use Chinese and I think black people, again, to demonize. In American history, we demonize black people a lot to get things illegal if we want them to, right? Goes back very deep in American history. And we made all these drugs illegal, essentially, all these opiates. You had to have a prescription for any of them. And heroin's just completely illegal. Other countries use heroin as a painkiller that can be prescribed. We do not in America. But the key to the opiate issue comes back to one particular drug. And if you are familiar with the drug scene in America, then you will know this one particular drug is the root cause of the modern day opiate crisis. Let's just be clear. The opiate crisis has exploded to what it was maybe during the time. You ever seen what's the movie with Denzel Washington when he's the kingpin in New York? I'm blanking on the name right now. Here, I can look it up. American Gangster, that's it. American Gangster, Denzel Washington, right? He's flooding the streets. I think this was in the 60s or 70s when he's flooding the streets of New York with good, pure heroin during Vietnam. That's what it was. He was getting it during Vietnam. And it was pure, good heroin. And there was a spike in opiate deaths, but nothing like we have today from fentanyl, which fentanyl has been around since the 50s or 60s, I believe it was invented. But the modern day chemistry of getting precursors has enabled widespread use of fentanyl, and the way economics simply works is fentanyl is a chemical produced in the lab. It just needs the precursors you can get from China, whereas the heroin, morphine, right, you need to grow poppy plants. And that's limited based on where you can grow poppy plants and how much and how quickly they grow. And obviously, certain companies grow poppy plants to get some of these drugs. And like we're in Afghanistan, for instance. And one of the reasons why we were in Afghanistan, we're not anymore. Thankfully, Biden pulled us out. But we were in Afghanistan, and we were controlling the poppy fields there, actually. So we were. It's just like oil, right? Poppy seeds or poppy plants that produce opium, morphine, heroin is just another resource that we were after. But now the fentanyl, because it can be made in a lab, you can produce as much as you want at any time based on the size of your lab and your production ability and your chemistry knowledge. So now people are making fentanyl and fentanyl analogs in their basement just by getting precursors from generally China, but it seeps its way into Mexico, where the major push for drugs comes into the U.S. Now, I've said the criminalization is the main key. So the criminalization part, right? We're making all these drugs illegal. So people are forced into the black market if they want to use these drugs. Then we have fentanyl come along where people can get as much... the fentanyl floods the market, right? So it takes over. You can't find really heroin anymore. I used to be a heroin addict for a long time, 15 years, 10 years, and initially I could find heroin. That's what I initially got hooked on until fentanyl came out, and now you can't even find fentanyl. Or you can't find heroin. I've only been able to find fentanyl for years now. Thankfully, I don't use it anymore, but when I was using it, that's the only thing on the street. It flooded the market, right? Took over, supply and demand. Okay, so once that fentanyl gets implemented in the market, right, and whether people get hooked on opiates from oxycodone, like their doctor shouldn't have put it on them, or the doctor doesn't know how to wean them off, or they just get into it through recreational drugs, it at least ends up to leading to fentanyl. And that's not including people who accidentally get essentially laced drugs, right? They're buying cocaine and the fentanyl happens to be in there. A bunch of comics just died not too long ago because they were all partying, thought they got some cocaine with fentanyl in it. They all died. And this is, unfortunately, is a far too common story. And so we have that criminalization part, right, of forcing people into the black market, and we have the fentanyl, which is ubiquitous now, and other even worse drugs are coming out that are now being laced with the fentanyl, like Trank and xylazine, that's what it's called, and benzodiazepine analogs, like, I forget, etizolam, midazolam, very powerful drugs that are obviously just increase the rate of overdose, to the point where overdoses are the number one killer in the age range from, I believe, like 20 to 40. Overdose is the number one cause, and fentanyl by far is the number one cause of the overdoses, by far. The opioid crisis is from fentanyl, is from our criminalization of drugs and forcing people into the black market. So what do we do about it, right? We've gotten to the point where, again, it's the leading killer of a major age group, the most productive age group in any country, from 20 to 40. If that's the number one killer, it should be our number one priority to try to relinquish people from these drugs. And how do we do that, right? So this is going to be the last part of this video. I think it's pretty clear the criminalization and the war on drugs has not worked, right? And this is not a left-right thing, because both parties have been a part of the war on drugs. So it's not a left-right thing. Both parties support the war on drugs. And let me just be clear. I'm talking about America specifically, the Democrats and the Republicans. And they both are completely owned by the military-industrial complex, the pharma companies. So they're both part of the same pot. They're both part of the same ideology, if you will. Essentially, they give us the illusion that we have a choice in America. But really, if they're both supporting the war on drugs, then, and we can't get any other party in, then again, we don't really have a choice whether the war on drugs goes on. It's up to the official. It's not up to democracy, right? It's up to the bureaucrats, and they've decided the war on drugs will continue. So that's the major thing I think needs to stop. We need to stop criminalization. And that's happened in like Portland, right? They decriminalized all drugs, and there's a huge backlash because they don't want all drugs decriminalized. But the key thing is they don't want all drugs decriminalized now because they see people just overdosing on the street when they just voted to have it decriminalized. Well, you can't just decriminalize drugs. You need education. You need safe injection sites. You need to give people the ability to get clean, pure drugs that are pharmaceutically made that we know aren't laced with fentanyl. But on top of that, you need to give people a community, a recovery network, right, to get into. You need to give people the ability to get housing and jobs. And the number one part about all this is education, right? We need to completely stop how we educating kids on drugs with the DARE program, telling them drugs are just bad. And that's not true. Drugs are all not just bad. All drugs are different. It's the mental health disorder of addiction that we need to stop. Well, thank you for listening to the first edition of The Right Fits. Kevin Fitzpatrick again. Please subscribe and like this video. I really appreciate, this is my first video, so I really appreciate it if you guys gave me plenty of likes on this. Thank you, guys.